She is now building a groundbreaking $60 million School of the Future here in Chicago as well, featuring cutting edge sustainability and community development. And I'm hopeful she's going to share a little bit more about that work. They just had the ribbon cutting about 3-4 weeks ago or so. So we'd love for you to follow along in her work there. She's very much a traveler, an international traveler, and she's traveled to over 100 different countries to study successful educational frameworks internationally. And she has a book called Reimagine Education that truly lays out the groundwork for how she sees the world and the work that she's done at AGC all these years. So one quick note, logistically, as you guys know who've been here with us quite a few times, we usually do Q&A at the end, so we'll save some time for that. So save your questions, think about your questions, and feel free to pop those in the chat, and Sarah and I can help facilitate through those at the end. So thank you again, Sarah Elizabeth, and we'll bring it over to you.
Well, thanks, Erin, and thanks, Sarah. It's so great to see all of you, and I'm really excited actually to learn more about you all. So I'm so glad that we've got some time for Q&A, but also hopefully some discussion at the end. But I'm excited to share with you a little bit more about this journey that's been now almost 2 decades. And just, to share a little bit more about how in the world we got here. This whole vision started in a former dental tool factory in the southwest side of Chicago. And as Erin shared, was sort of inspired by visiting schools in over 100 countries. And now just, a matter of weeks ago, kind of opened our doors to this learning environment that we have spent the last couple of decades dreaming about and reimagining. So I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit and share with you about sort of what led us to that journey and what's been happening for the last couple of decades, what we've learned, and then how we've translated some of those learnings into what's going on today with almost 600 kids that are now learning in this School of the Future. So backing up a little bit and explaining kind of how things landed on the southwest side of Chicago. I actually grew up in the Midwest, but in Michigan. And as a child, I had these like fantasies and dreams of someday having a passport. That was sort of my dream, because it was not something that in my family per se, that was something that I thought was possible. So needless to say, I ended up going to graduate school in England. And for me, having not left the country and been surrounded by people or now being surrounded by people from all over the world, I was so fascinated and so intrigued to suddenly be hearing all of these different perspectives. My new friends were talking about their own educational experiences. And I was suddenly realizing, like, oh my goodness, people are learning very differently in other parts of the world. And here I went to a school, right, where there were many desks and we all kind of did the same thing. And was just aghast, quite frankly, as I was sort of making sense of how other people perceived America and America's public education system. And so even though I wasn't studying education, I would pack up my backpack, and on the weekends, I would take my dissertation writing on the road. And as a way of sort of getting out of my youth hostel, I started visiting schools. I started traveling. Throughout this experience, as you can imagine, started developing some pretty key questions and key realizations, right? Kind of realizing, and this is now, again, like almost 20 years ago, but realizing, holy smokes, like we're living in a much more globally connected world, and things are changing quickly here. Sort of really wondering about the state of our world and how we're really preparing this next generation to be thriving in this kind of environment. Of course, making these connections with how, unlike my own educational experiences, we've got to be preparing kids for this much more globally connected world. And of course, what I saw firsthand was really making these connections with the state of our environment and realizing, like, we're going to be facing some pretty significant challenges in our lifetime. And these young people are going to need to be equipped with the right kinds of skill sets to be tackling some of these things. So, with all of that, and sort of as a young person, as I think we all had these convictions and beliefs, and a certain level of naivete, started developing all these opinions about what school should be. If we were to reinvent education, what should it really look like? What really mattered? So I kind of went back to school in some ways, and very informally, not ever really going to school to study education, but as I said, starting to visit these schools all over the world. And I started discovering and finding some answers in some of the most unexpected places. Of course, I visited schools all over Scandinavia and followed Maria Montessori's footsteps and visited sort of all the schools that you might imagine. But it was really in some of the most sort of unexpected moments and places that I started to develop these connections to kind of what really ultimately then inspired the Academy for Global Citizenship's model. So I'll kind of walk you through a few of them, a few of the highlights, but then really kind of shift gears into more kind of what's happening today at AGC. So a number of questions, I mean, seven of them, I guess, in particular, that I began asking that ultimately did kind of shape the model at AGC, starting with how we can really be developing or creating schools where there's more collaboration with the world and how that can become foundational to a model. And so when I visited Rwanda, for example, seeing just the incredible level of investment in entrepreneurship and in young people, and how, as a result of some of the challenges in the country, there had been such an increase in the level of collaboration, and how we can be thinking about inspiring these lifelong learners. When I was in Iran, for example, seeing just the incredible amounts of kind of multi-generational gathering and learning, and how young people were learning and from their elders, and that was such a really significant kind of part of the culture. How we can be inspiring student-centered learning. And I remember in Tunisia, for example, when there was a strike, and they needed people to come together and create these learning environments that were really placing children at the center. So I won't dive into kind of all of these ins and outs, but as you can see, some of the questions here that started emerging from me about these non-negotiables, right? Health and wellness and student-centered learning, how well-being, of course, just felt like such an imperative, particularly given, some of the challenges that we're seeing now as a country, as a society, as a humanity. These began to feel like they were essential for the way that we're thinking about educating our next generation. And I'm sure essential to all of you. I'm sure these are not new concepts in terms of the kinds of things that you're thinking about as imperatives, in terms of connecting to our environment and cultivating young people who have this love and passion for our earth. So with all of that, and with all of these questions, began developing a lot of opinions and a lot of perspectives throughout these years. And when I moved to Chicago, grappling with all of this, right, trying to make sense with all of these opinions and beliefs, I thought, we've got to reimagine education. Like it is an imperative, right? That we cannot go on continuing to educate kids in the way that we have. And when I moved to Chicago, after thinking that this was just a global challenge, right? After all of these years of visiting schools all over the world and recognizing the global disparities and the global inequities, I realized I was now living in this international city that was experiencing some of the most significant disparities and inequities and challenges in my own backyard. And I was outraged. I woke up and believed that not only do we have to do something, but we can do something about this. And again, pretty naive and idealistic in my early 20s. I jumped on my bike. I rode down to the Board of Education. And as Erin explained, I just explained all of this to the Board of Education, thinking that, of course, they would they would be delighted, right, with these ideas. Of course, they would agree with me as a 23-year-old who'd never been a teacher and has never worked in a school. And that is absolutely not what happened. As you can imagine, they looked at me like I was a little crazy, and unfortunately denied this proposal. Despite, I was aghast, quite frankly. I thought, this is such a great idea, and this has to exist. I can't believe that they wouldn't approve this as a public school. But needless to say, it took a few years. I had to go back 3 times to the Board of Education until they approved the Academy for Global Citizenship as a public charter school in 2007. And then we had a matter of months, to 8 months exactly, to sort of translate these 600 pages into this former dental tool factory on the Southwest Side, where we were serving 96% minority, primarily low-income students, with this wildly different model within the public education system, with a completely different framework and a completely different kind of guiding mission, right, for what really mattered and what really, at the end of the day, was sort of the purpose of education. And so we opened our doors in 2008. And if you've heard anything or read anything about the Academy for Global Citizenship, there's a number of things that really set us apart in terms of what we've been implementing now for kindergarten through 8th grade students, I should mention, for the last 16 years. So this is our 16th school year. And the first is this transdisciplinary and inquiry-based, very experiential approach. So we are an International Baccalaureate World School, for those of you who are familiar with the IB program. And so all of our students kind of learn their core subjects in this applied and experiential way, where they're studying these globally relevant, oftentimes environmentally relevant themes. They're asking questions about human rights and the future of sustainable technologies, and their kind of core learning is integrated, right, into more of an experiential approach. We are a dual language immersion model as well. So all of our students are on track to achieve biliteracy by the time they graduate from 8th grade. So that's another kind of fundamental part of our model, and what we believe is just not only good for kids' brains, but it's going to be good for their futures to have that skill set. We really focus a lot on how to kind of open our doors, to our former dental tool factory. We're no longer there. You'll hear a little bit more about kind of what's currently going on. But how do we open the doors, not only of our school, but of our students' experiences, right? To have these collaborative partnerships with other schools, with other entities all over the world. And so that's been a huge priority to develop these really meaningful partnerships, right? Where our students are collaborating and sometimes tackling some of these global challenges with their peers in other parts of the world. Of course, these are such critical elements when we talk about creativity and ensuring that we're really incorporating music and the arts, and again, kind of connecting that, not just as a standalone, let's go do in our class, but really integrating that into our students' learning and making these global connections with different cultures, and how that integrates into so much of their transdisciplinary learning. We believe that we've got some young, social entrepreneurs, and part of, being a global citizen and part of being an environmental leader is having these not just skill sets, but this mindset that they can create and they can innovate and they can spearhead these new ideas and initiatives. And so entrepreneurship is very much kind of embedded into the philosophy and into the framework of what goes on at AGC. We've got quite an interesting social justice culture that has been cultivated over the years, and our students, I think, from a very early age, see themselves and the role that they play and the power of their voice and agency in the way that we kind of integrate that. And that's part of the International Baccalaureate framework as well, is that starting in kindergarten, and now we've got 3-year-olds, so we've got an early childhood program, but there's this sense of action where students at the end of a unit, at the end of something they've learned, they have to take action. They have to show the world what they're learning. And so that gets reinforced in this incredible sort of learning cycle, and gets reinforced in terms of the sense of activism and justice. We've got some really remarkable, and part of this too is sort of the IB framework, but also part of our model is really thinking about these other skills and these other, what the IB calls the attitudes, right? But how can we instill from a very young age a sense of civic responsibility? And that, of course, kind of connects back to the sense of activism. A big part of what we do, especially given the population of students that we serve and the kinds of challenges and inequities that we have in our community, I think it's so incredibly important for us to be engaging our families and guardians and community members, and doing that in a way that's really meaningful to our students' learning. So, of course, there's a tremendous amount of workshops and classes and things that are happening. Last night, we had a big STEM night. Some of our parents were actually participating and sharing their knowledge and sharing their skills in these experiential ways, but involving our parents as class speakers, and really just kind of integrating their presence alongside their children's learning, as we think, of course, they are the third teacher and such a critical part of that partnership. Health and nutrition. I know that this is such an obvious one, but we work in a community that is medically underserved, that is food insecure. We have a 53% higher obesity rate in kindergarten than the Chicago average. And of course, understand all the correlative data between health and nutrition and mindfulness, and sort of long-term ability to thrive. And so we serve 100% scratch-made, primarily plant-forward, organic food 3 times a day to our students, and integrate all sorts of experiential hands-on cooking and nutrition education classes. Of course, we have gardens and all sorts of ways to really be facilitating these connections, which relates to the body and brain connection. We have something at AGC called the Wellness Wheel, where every day our students are immersed in a wellness class, where they're really taught from an early age about the 6 different dimensions of well-being. And it's not just about like going to gym and running some laps and climbing the rope. It's about mindfulness. It's about these other aspects, and these other tools, right? That I think as adults, maybe we all wish we had more of these days in terms of managing our stress and managing sort of the realities of some of these planetary and global challenges. So something that we just think are such foundational building blocks for our kids to be building. We integrate a lot of yoga and nature. In fact, we're working with an amazing researcher who's actually on site today from Washington, who's looking at outdoor time and nature-based learning and how this impacts our brain. She's actually scanning our children's brains today, which is so cool. My gosh, right? The power of being outside and the power of being in nature, especially in a community like ours, where kids haven't had these kinds of opportunities to be outside and to have these connections. Sustainability is a huge part of our school's mission, especially as we talk about cultivating this next generation of environmental leaders. And so that is integrated into all of our operations and the way that we not only create a curriculum that incorporates environmental sustainability and environmental mindedness, but in the way that we operate our facility. And this is something that we've been doing since day one in our former dental tool factory. And now in a few minutes, you'll hear a little bit more about like what's going on today, which is very much kind of pushing the envelope from what we did before, but everything from having a zero waste, cafeteria to the way that we integrate organic foods to integrating composting, and we have chickens in our schoolyard, and making all of these different connections for our young people, again, to really reinforce these connections and the role that they play in kind of cultivating a more sustainable future. One of the ways that kind of translates then in 8th grade, all of our students have the opportunity to go on an international service learning trip So some of our students end up going abroad, and we've developed some really neat partnerships with some organizations and opportunities for them to go and restore mangroves, and for them to kind of apply some of this learning and knowledge and language and kind of global perspective. And some of them choose to stay in the United States, and we have service learning opportunities in the United States, but kind of another really big part of our model of taking action and really kind of culminating, right, all of this learning into now kind of going out and creating change in the world. So I could clearly talk for days about all the ins and outs, and I assume, all of you are much more immersed in the world of education than most people that I typically talk to. And so I feel like, okay, you kind of get it. Like you already have a good pulse on, kind of what is important when we're thinking about reimagining learning. And as Erin shared, over the last couple of decades, foundational to our mission from day one was really opening our doors to the world. And we knew that we were not going to have everything right? Like we knew that we were going to be probably failing quite a bit and trying things and piloting things that, my goodness, now that I look back, right, as having slightly more experience in my early 20-year-old self and realizing like, oh my goodness, we had all of these ideas and some of them worked and some of them had to be refined over the years. But needless to say, we've been able to share these practices. We've been able to train 10,000 educators and have been able to sort of have this broader impact by kind of incubating these ideas, incubating these innovations, and then collaborating with other teachers and with other schools and districts and sometimes countries in terms of supporting other place-based initiatives and thinking about how they can adapt these aspects of our model to their own context, and something that we're extremely passionate about, just in terms of our bigger and broader mission and purpose, right? In terms of where this is, how we think about scale. Very intentionally, of course, have not gone and created more campuses. That's not kind of the method and the vision for scale, but rather thinking about how can we inspire others and share these learnings in various capacities. And of course, and I haven't shown any pictures of the dental tool factory, but if only you guys could see our very humble and hilarious beginnings in this dental tool factory. We were so passionate about opening the school in a community that was at the very top of the list in terms of underperformance and overcrowding. And Chicago Public Schools and the mayor's office at the time knew that this is one of the most critical areas for new schools to be developed. And of course, a part of our city that didn't have anything like this. And we upgraded in our second year to a former barrel factory. And then we figured out how to operate and sort of like modify this other building where we had a ton of asphalt, right? Like we did not have any nature space at all, except for some weeds growing in between the alley and the asphalt parking lot. But we were able to convert this into like a little mini farm. We had schoolyard chickens, we had raised bed gardens, we had a native species garden, we had a pollinator garden, we had a big greenhouse, we had rain barrels. It's like we did what we could in these humble ways to kind of immerse our kids. But at the end of the day, we would fantasize and we would dream about someday, wouldn't it be amazing if we could completely reinvent what a learning environment looks like. And for the last couple of decades, I think people thought we were pretty nuts, understandably so, because we would talk about all of these ideas. And once we got going, like more ideas started coming, right? More people came up with even wilder and more ambitious ideas. And kind of like the crazier, we were like, yes, we love this idea of yes, apiaries, yes, orchards, yes, let's convert, land into a huge farm in the middle of a food desert. Yes, let's think about being net positive energy. Like nothing seemed impossible, right? Even though the world was telling us like, this is a little ridiculous. Like you guys are living in some sort of la la land. We just kept growing the ambition and the vision. Alongside a lot of our community members, right? Community members that have been living in our community for decades, kept sharing their hopes and their dreams. We're in a part of the city, the school was located 2 blocks away from a public housing project site. And it's a part of the city in Chicago on the Southwest side that's really been segregated from a lot of resources, right? There's been disinvestment. It's disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice. As I mentioned, food insecure and medically underserved, and people don't have access to a grocery store nearby, all of these things, right? So we kept hearing all these dreams and these hopes of, wouldn't it be amazing if we could incorporate multi-generational learning pathways so that every member of our community could develop the skills that they need to thrive, right? And so we kept dreaming, we kept creating, we kept inventing. We had some pretty amazing people agree to kind of help us on this journey along the way, who thought we were crazy, but also were like, I don't know, like we might as well join them. And what else are we going to do, right? Just, frustrated and overwhelmed by the state of our world. And so over the years, we kept thinking about, how do we sort of continue to translate these lessons? Like, what would it mean to invent a school where all of these things became central to the way we thought about a learning environment? Should we even have classrooms? We started asking these kinds of questions, and no wonder why people thought we were nuts. So this kind of became the framework for that book that we wrote, and it's time to rewrite, because we wrote all of this before we built this thing, and we had all these ideas that have now kind of been translated into the way that we've thought about it. And so the book sort of outlines these 7 different principles and how we applied them in our dental tool factory, in our barrel factory, and how we thought about doing this in the future, right? How we dreamed about this in the future, but now it's like we just moved into this place. But I know much of this concept is not going to be new to people like you, who are innovators and who have been exposed to all of these progressive approaches. But essentially, the way that we designed this learning environment doesn't have classrooms as we know it. We have designed this learning environment that is really focused on. It's not a completely open concept. It's not, just like this wide open space, but rather we have designed a series of villages in our school that are multi-age, that have a variety of sort of differentiated learning spaces within the village. So there are these commonalities among all the villages, but the developmental scale of some of these elements looks very different for early childhood than it does for our middle school village, right? Our 6th through 8th graders who are together in one space. Our kindergarten through 1st grade village looks different than our 4th and 5th grade village. But essentially, we now have these teams of educators who are all collaboratively working together within this multi-age space, right? With 120 students, and sort of differentiating the learning throughout the course of the day to optimize the skills that they as educators have and the needs that our students have sort of within this space. Pretty soon we're going to have more pictures of what this looks like, and it would be fun to show you guys, but you're all welcome to come and visit actually, and just come check it out, because it's pretty interesting to see it in action in terms of what this actually looks like. And to be honest, we're still figuring it out, right? We moved into this space a matter of weeks ago, and all of our villages, for example, have a teaching kitchen. And so we have 6 teaching kitchens within the school. One of them is for adults, one of them is for tiny children. And these have all been designed based on the different developmental ages of our kids and what they should be learning as it relates to nutrition and cooking. And all of our villages have a plaza where they can gather. The whole village can come and gather. So again, these different learning landscapes that accommodate different types of learners, but different forms of learning, right? Sometimes kids need to kind of crawl into a cave. Sometimes we have something called a watering hole, right? Where there's different opportunities for collaboration, for small groups coming together, a super adaptable and flexible learning environment. So this gives you a snapshot of a little bit about what's going on here and sort of how we've tackled this, at least in our first phase. So we just finished constructing the big building that you see on the left. It's a 71,000 square foot 2-story building. And so the school, the Academy for Global Citizenship, is on the second floor, the kindergarten through 8th grade students. And then on the ground floor, we've incorporated a number of community serving elements and components, because as I mentioned, the ambition and the dreams and the needs kind of grew ultimately into kind of a community hub is what we are now calling this. It's no longer a school, it's a place for every member of our community to come and plug in and be part of what's happening here. As you can see, there's a lot of solar panels on this building. And I think as Erin mentioned, this campus is on track to be the first in the state of Illinois to achieve the most sustainable kind of innovation in the world. So the most robust sustainability framework called the Living Building Challenge. It requires us to be net positive energy, net positive water, completely climate resilient, fossil fuel free. There's like all sorts of really difficult things that have gone into every material has had to be vetted going into this building. And of course, the technology, especially in a place like Chicago, to pull this off, I think is one reason why this hasn't happened yet in the state of Illinois. But we're on track. We're super excited. What you can't see in this image is like the 50 geothermal wells that have been drilled in the back underneath the farm. The 550 kilowatts of photovoltaics are a little bit more visible and are going to be, battery storage and all of these things. But that's not only for us, just a great thing to be doing from a sustainability perspective, but really fascinating to think about how we could build a building where we make all of these different technologies transparent so that kids can be learning from them. Like it becomes sort of like a real life learning lab and science lab and innovation lab for kids and adults to be making these connections and learning about how these things work. And so there's a lot of experiential, bilingual, museum style signage that's being rolled out and designed. There's kind of energy monitors and displays that show kind of real-time data. There's just all sorts of neat ways that we can sort of like bring that to life in terms of in and of itself serving as this experiential learning landscape. And yes, we just had our ribbon cutting. So it's like, it's pretty wild. And it's been fascinating these last few weeks, just having people come and see this after we've been talking people's ears off for the last 2 decades. Anybody that would listen, we're like, we're trying to reach education. And we have all of these ideas to create a net positive energy school where there's a big learning barn and there's chickens running around and kids are doing yoga every day. And we're going to have orchards and apiaries. And people were like, oh my goodness gracious. I now kind of, I can kind of now look back and realize like why sometimes people just thought, okay, that sounds like some form of utopia that's never ever going to happen. And so it was not an easy process to raise $63 million, despite all of our enthusiasm and all of our passion and thinking this is such a great idea. As you can imagine, I think that a lot of people had a hard time wrapping their heads around this being possible. We were really trying to do a lot of things, that just hadn't been done before. We're a public school. We're part of the public education system. And we just somehow designed a school that has no classrooms. CPS didn't really catch it until they came to visit. And so there were a lot of things about this that I think, people felt like we're a little nuts. And now these last few weeks has been so interesting, hosting funders and visitors who are now like, this is such a great idea. Every community should have something like this. And so it's both thrilling, of course, that people are now getting it. And also it's a little bit exhausting because we're like, why couldn't you see this before? That, having healthcare and having a fresh food marketplace, having all of these things within a community hub is what every community deserves and what every community needs to really cultivate thriving humans and a thriving community. And so this gives you kind of just an overview of what's going on here and what's yet to come. There's these 3 buildings in the lower right-hand corner that have not yet been constructed. So this is our next phase. But the Hive, and you can see the different things that are incorporated into the Hive. There's community wellness facilities. There's a neighborhood fresh food marketplace. There's the 6 teaching kitchens. One of them's a community teaching kitchen. We've got, just all sorts of neat. And then a Head Start, early childhood Head Start center is there, a federally qualified healthcare center that provides both healthcare, but also behavioral and mental health services to anyone in our community. So all sorts of exciting things are happening in our first phase, which is really connected to kind of this bigger, broader mission. And now a delineated nonprofit organization that's actually been established to really serve as the umbrella for all of this. What ended up happening is that the kind of the mission and the vision really outgrew in many ways our nonprofit, which was originally established to be a school. And so in the last couple of years, we formed, along with a number of community members and community voices that are now governing the board, a new nonprofit called Cultivate Collective. And so we now have this bigger, broader sort of umbrella organization called Cultivate Collective. And then also the Academy for Global Citizenship's nonprofit. So there's these 2 different nonprofit organizations now that are sort of involved in kind of overseeing this hub. And as you can see, Cultivate Collective has a much larger vision and mission to really cultivate this network of sustainable communities all over the world. And there's these 4 elements that are kind of foundational to the Cultivate model that I think link back to just about everything that we've learned about education, and realizing that there's these 4 imperatives, not only as we think about the future of learning, but as we think about the future of communities. And that's, you can see them here, but education, of course, like that's where our root, that's where it all began. But of course, every community needs access to amazing education. And for us, education doesn't stop at the kids. I think that's one thing that we've learned over the years, is that this really does need to become multi-generational. We do need to find these ways for all members of our community to plug in. Wellness, of course. I know these seem so obvious, especially to people who are already like on the journey, doing such great work in different parts of the country. But health and wellness, again, we cannot have a thriving community or thriving families if people don't have access to fresh food and healthcare, and just the fundamental basic services that they need. For us, sustainability is a big one. It's interesting when you look at these national models of kind of holistic community revitalization, you do often see healthcare and schools, and you see, mixed income housing, which is actually getting built now around the site. It's a public housing project site, right? So 700 units of mixed income housing surrounding our 6.5 acres. But they kind of leave sustainability out. And it's for us, we see this as not only essential in the way that we're thinking about developing, cultivating young people, but we see this as just an imperative as it relates to the systemic kind of inequity and environmental injustice in the way that we're seeing climate change disproportionately impact communities of color. And so for us, this is a huge part of our sort of social justice and racial justice mission. And then the 4th piece is economic vitality, having these avenues and these pathways to close the racial wealth gap. And this very much connects kind of to the next phase of our work, which incorporates a Green Business Institute. So it's kind of an ecosystem that's multifaceted and ensuring that we've got all the different partners and pieces that community members need to kind of further their own journey as it relates to career paths and job opportunities and skills and workforce development. And then also developing a teacher training institute and kind of a learning laboratory that will be another facility where we can welcome people, continue welcoming people from all over the world while the Academy for Global Citizenship is operating. We see there being such amazing value, right? And having people come, not in the summertime or not on spring break, but like come and be immersed and like, and to be able to see what this looks like, what it means for kids to be working out on a farm and learning math in the context of measuring our geothermal wells and these sorts of things. So this just gives you a couple of quick snapshots into what's to come in terms of our Learning Lab and our Teacher Training Institute. But really, I would love for you guys to come visit, and you're welcome anytime. For those of you who live in Chicago, but also if you're ever going to be passing through, please reach out to us, because we would love we would love to learn about your big ideas and all the ways that you're thinking about changing the future of learning and changing the world. I've heard there's some pretty remarkable people that plug into these meetings. So we would love to learn more about you and see if there are ways to be learning from each other and collaborating with one another and inspiring each other to keep pushing the envelope and to keep doing what many people may feel is a little crazy and impossible. So here's my contact info if there's any follow-up questions, but also happy to just, field any questions now and just open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much. That was so amazing. And I love how you talk about the work and all of what you've done these last years. It's just incredible to hear, just how you talk about it so unassumingly. But of course, I think this group has so many great questions, I'm sure, around how did you do that, around advocacy and around funding and all of those things, in addition to some of the programmatic decisions and things. But I'll hit it over to you guys. I know you have questions, but I just have a first question around, entrepreneurially, I'm curious, are there any of the sort of like best unintended consequences that you've seen even just the last few weeks around, wow, I didn't know that would happen, but I'm so excited and happy that that's happening. Anything on that front?
Oh gosh, there's so many different ways that I could answer that question. I mean, it is fascinating to see what's happening right now in terms of, even though we've done all this planning and preparation with our teachers and with our students and even with our families, and like, does everyone realize what they're signing up for? Like, if you keep working here, we are about to move into this facility where there's no, there is just very different learning environment. And in some ways, we're saying like everyone's job descriptions literally just went out the window, right? It's almost like a completely new job. You're no longer a teacher in the way that you've known teaching. Even though we were doing pretty interesting and progressive things before, it's just a completely different environment. So it's fascinating what teachers are saying and what we're learning. I mean, things are not going super smoothly. There are some things that are going so beautifully, and then there's others where we're like, we're like figuring a lot of things out and sort of reinventing, which is fascinating to see. So there's some pretty cool things though that I think teachers are seeing that just would never, in terms of unintended consequences, and maybe they were a bit intended, but just the level of even the transitioning from like a classroom-based approach to a multi-age approach, and the kinds now of interactions and opportunities, right, for students of different ages to be sort of supporting and working with one another. But we're also seeing some pretty incredible things happening on the community level in terms of people coming over and sort of reluctantly like, what is going on over here, right? Like, what is this place that people keep saying is for me? And it's just been fascinating to see the hope that's emerging for the first time in a very, very long time in a community that didn't have a lot of reasons to be hopeful about the future, and to see just the assets and the strengths and the ideas of community members now coming to the table, like wanting to share their passions, wanting to share their knowledge, wanting to mentor young people, wanting to, teach the next generation about their skills. Yeah.
And I see, Paul, you have some questions here. One more question on that. I love the villages idea so much. And I know the one room schoolhouse concept has been big, and the Acton Academy kind of started thinking about that with their franchise model. So I'm wondering, like, where was that inspiration for you, and how did you decide on that? How did that sort of make its way into the centerpiece of how the building was constructed?
Yeah, it's in some ways it just sort of emerged to become kind of an obvious, as we were thinking about what it was that we were trying to cultivate, right? In all of these, we were talking about the attributes, and we're talking about the purpose of education and sort of like what really matters, in 20 years in terms of the skills. And we started thinking about the level of collaboration and adaptability and critical thinking and creativity and all the different things, right, that we all know to be kind of the most essential skills these days, right? I'm sure in all the people that we're hiring, like we are looking more for those types of aptitudes these days than people that with typically, oftentimes, right? Those things matter so much more than a credential. And so we started, asking ourselves, like, what kind of environment is going to enable that most effectively to occur? And the collaboration piece, I think, among educators as well, sort of rethinking the role of an educator. And I see Paul's asked about how we're like helping teachers shape their new identities. One thing that we've done and that we're sort of like in the thick of that's been really, really profound. Like in many ways, I sort of wish we had this from day one, no matter, irrespective of this transition. I'm like, oh my gosh, what would have gone differently if we would have had this from day one? And it's something called the design studio. So we knowing that we were about to do some crazy things, we asked our educators, like, does anyone want to join our design studio? Like, it's an opt-in thing. People got compensated a stipend to do it. And we had about 20 people opt in to like, yes, I want to become a part of the design studio. And so we would meet sometimes weekly. One time we went on a retreat. Sometimes it was, we tried to make it like fun and exciting and yummy food and these kinds of things. But ultimately, like, people put in a ton of additional hours because they wanted to, because they were at the forefront of making these decisions. They were the innovators. They were the ones that were like, okay, we're about to sort of transition into this facility. How do we tackle these challenges, right? Or how do we think about schedules? How do we think differently about time? How do we want to spend a third of our day outdoors, even in the blizzard, snowy Chicago weather? How do we do that? How do we design weather rooms? What kind of gear do we need, right? With students who sometimes come to school without wearing jackets. All of these things, like all the things got put on the table, and week by week, or, we would tackle them. And it was such and now we're continuing to do it. So we sort of like put a pause on the design studio because we're all feeling a little overwhelmed with the move. And then a few weeks ago, the challenges started emerging again. And people were like, oh my gosh, it's going to start snowing. How are we going to tackle XYZ, right? How are we going to manage these kinds of things? And we thought, I know, let's reignite the design studio. And so now we've created a series of like micro design studio challenges where people can, rather than saying like, okay, I'm going to opt into this massive commitment for the next year of my life, people can opt in to solve a particular challenge. So we have these sort of like micro sessions now, right? Where people are like, oh yeah, I want to put my heads together with other people about how we do this, or how we reimagine X, right? And so that's been a really great tool for us, and something that I think can be adapted in so many different environments, but something that people have really enjoyed, I think, stepping up in this professional capacity. And also they see this as a pathway. Eventually we will be having this physical institute for teaching other people. I mean, we have trained 10,000 educators. Many of our educators have been involved in that work, but now there's a more formal institute. So we have various partnerships even this year, working on creating a consortia of place-based schools across the country that's being supported by a funder who's really interested in scaling some of these aspects of our model. And those teachers who are stepping up have the opportunity to sort of be part of that effort. And I think we're seeing, for many of our educators, like, that's a really exciting professional growth opportunity to kind of be moving into a space where they're not only impacting our kids' lives every day, which is like noble enough to just be a teacher who's like changing kids' lives, but then to be, feeling like their work has more of a systemic impact.
How about?
David said in the chat, I'm reminded of a quote from Bill McDonough. I don't know how to say McDonough, author of Cradle to Cradle. We can't expect our children to save the world unless they love the world. What role does empathy play in AGC's mission?
Oh my gosh, I love this. I feel like I need to take this quote and frame it. And we've been thinking about like, what would putting in our, the entryway when people come in. And I think this is really powerful. It's something that we, in a couple of different ways we think about this. One, for us, we believe so firmly in this place-based kind of cultivating a love for nature for us, like being in this asphalt parking lot, we had to do this in some pretty creative ways, right? It was like, we believe that in order for a child to have empathy and care for climate change or for what's happening halfway across the world, like they first had to fall in love with nature in their own backyard. And so we got pretty creative in the ways that we did that, right? Whether it was like finding bugs in our, next to our parking lot, or noticing the birds in our neighborhood, or, a caterpillar. I mean, it was like, pretty small, but mighty ways. I mean, we've all seen the magic and the wonder that a child has when they, when they see a butterfly, and developing just that love and that appreciation before we start introducing the tragedies. We have this sort of saying, but also a practice where we don't introduce tragedies before 4th grade. So developmentally, I really think it's important for kids to first kind of develop that awe and that wonder and that love and that appreciation, without saying like, animals are going extinct, and before introducing them to the realities. One, obviously for developmental reasons, but two, to kind of first establish that empathy and that love, which for a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, like very difficult for them to develop the love and the empathy, not for all, but for many developmentally, develop that love and empathy. For kids in Tunisia and Uganda and halfway across the world. So first, kind of understanding their own community, their own selves, right? A very place-based kind of philosophy around that. And then, we do introduce some pretty heavy and serious topics in those later years. But it's students at that point have developed agency, and they are empowered, I think, to feel like they can do something about it, because they already have, right? They've already in 2nd grade done a plastic protest, right? Where they educated people in their community about these smaller things. And so for them, they're then at a point where they feel like they can do something about the challenges that they're learning about.
Okay, we have one last question. It says, thank you for this inspiring talk. How have you dealt with the resistance from admin, teacher, parents of breaking away from the traditional education system? There's so much promise in inquiry-based learning, but how do we communicate that to people who haven't thought about learning in such a transformative lens?
I don't know what you're talking about. We don't have any resistance. I'm just kidding. Oh my gosh, let me tell you the story. We just introduced, by the way, we built this school that has only all gender bathrooms, only. So there is not a bathroom that is like a single gender bathroom in the entire building. Let me tell you, that one was, that was a little bit of an interesting one. But no, we of course, like, even though the Academy for Global Citizenship has had a very different mission from day one, wow, we are seeing this shift. Of course, we're seeing the resistance, right? Of course, we're seeing, even among our amazing educators, it's really tough. Like, it's really tough to have your whole job reinvented, especially for some of our educators who've been teaching for 20 years and to now feel like, what am I doing? So it's tough. I think we try to keep the long view in terms of, it's really tough and heartbreaking, right? When we have someone transition, but we're also recognizing like, it's really going to take the right people to be on this bus. Cause we're headed in a pretty, a pretty ambitious direction. And so, I think that we do our best to kind of bring people along with us, and to come and kind of be immersed and how it's working. I think when people can see it, that's been a tough thing, right? It's easy for me to say that, like, because for 20 years we couldn't do that. We couldn't say like, come see, it's going to be fine. Because we didn't, we were like, it was a leap of faith. Right. And but now people can come and see it and see examples of what is working, using that, tapping into that design studio, for example, to kind of really be those leaders and change makers to help bring their peers along.
Sarah Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure to learn from you. And I was struck by your grit and resiliency and innovation to do all of these things. It's just truly an incredible example. So thank you for sharing your work with us. And thank you everybody for joining us. And we hope to see you again next month.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yes. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.